What's up, everybody? It's Chicago Talk Show host, and I'm here to talk to you about the road rage and this narcissism connection.
Top story at 10, road rage ending in gunfire is on the rise nationwide.
So out here in Chicago, it's been getting worse. It gets worse every year, especially in the summer. As soon as it starts getting nice out and the sun comes out and the long summer nights come out, the worst Chicago drivers come out as well. So like one of the things that I've been seeing lately is if someone's behind you and that person behind you thinks that you're driving too slow, or they think that they're just a better driver than you in their own fantasy world, they will go right in front of you and they will do whatever it takes to just get in front of you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the lanes. It doesn't matter the danger, the construction, people trying to walk in the crosswalks. It doesn't matter. They will do whatever it takes to just get right in front of you by one car. And then they think, ha, now I'm in front of you because of whatever reason in my own world, and I have established dominance. I think I'm better than you. I don't trust you're going too slow. I'm so important that I just need to get right in front of you, even though there's a red light right there. You know, reason and logic doesn't matter. It's about the narcissism. So about a couple of months ago, I was listening to E. Michael Jones's one of his interviews, and he referenced a Culture Wars magazine article from back in 2002 in January. And it's the title of the Culture Wars article is called Education as Magic. And actually it's called Harry Potter and the Culture of Narcissism. So it's a great read. I highly recommend it. You can get it at culturewars.com. But why don't we just start off by talking about, what this idea of what narcissism is. Like, what is this narcissism, let alone culture of narcissism? EMJ writes directly from the article, since narcissism is a personality disorder that is predicated on a failure to adopt realistic norms about the relationship between desire and reality, the people who control the culture through advertising and psychoanalysis began to promote the narcissists as the ideal citizen of the new culture of overt self-indulgence and covert social control. So let's continue. EMJ writes, the goal of the social engineering that destroyed communities and promoted sexual indulgence after World War II was the, quote, empty, end quote, narcissistic self. That self was full of illusion and of omnipotence that characterized narcissism as a personality disorder. But it was also full of the insecurity that went with the delusion. As a result, the self, which has been rendered empty by the systematic destruction of community and family, the only elements that can give it a sense of belonging, content, and therefore reality, must seek its sense of content or reality elsewhere, namely, quote, by purchasing and ingesting the product, which will magically transfer the lifestyle of the model to the consumer, end quote. The self has been crippled by being tied to narcissistic fantasies, which alternate between grandiose conceptions of the self and feelings of impotence and emptiness when those fantasies, as is always the case, are not fulfilled. Once the self has been confirmed in this pathology, the culture which promoted the pathology arrives on the scene with the cure. Consumption is the magic that makes this transformation possible. Quote, the customer's problems will simply disappear when the magical transfer takes place. So that's interesting, right? We're taught through this materialistic world, this consumer world. It's like, yes, buy this thing and it'll make you feel better. And you can do this with a lot of things. Buy X and it'll help you feel better. It'll complete you. Now, X, modernity loves to kind of pitch different kind of lifestyles or things that they know will not satisfy the soul, but you know, they're cute enough or it's fun enough for a little bit to at least distract you or make it in your own mind, make it seem like it's fulfilling, but in the end of the day it won't be, right? Your spirit needs more. So let's get into the culture of narcissism. So I want to talk to you about someone named Philip Cushman, who I found through this article that EMJ wrote, Dr. E. Michael Jones. And so in the article we're going to talk about that. So EMJ writes, the culture of narcissism is populated by people who manifest what Philip Cushman has called, quote, the empty self, end quote. Something that Cushman has noticed as a personality type that is discussed in, quote, current psychological discourse about narcissism and borderline states. Again, this is about 20 years ago, so keep that in mind. But I suspect not all too much has changed. The creation of the, quote, empty self, end quote, as a paradigm of the ideal citizen in America and other consumerist states in the West began in the early 20th century as part of the, quote, historical shift, end quote, away from the Victorian sexually restricted self, end quote. A personality based on saving and restraint of impulse, particularly restraint of sexual impulse. Quote, Americans have slowly changed from a Victorian people who had a deeply felt need to save money and restrict their sexual and aggressive impulses, end quote, into the opposite, namely, quote, a people who have a deeply felt need to spend money and indulge their impulses, end quote. The new normative self, which came into being after World War II, is, quote, empty, end quote, because it, quote, experiences a significant absence of community, tradition, and shared meaning. It is empty in part because of the loss of family, community, and tradition, end quote. As a result, the new self tries to compensate for its emptiness by consumption. Because it perceives itself as, quote, empty, end quote, the, quote, post-World War II self thus yearns to acquire and consume as an unconscious way of compensating for what has been lost, end quote. Community, right? So the breakdown of community as modernity advances, right? We don't see any malls anymore. There used to be like clubs. People in neighborhoods would get together and do stuff. Bowling alleys, be a part of leagues. You would invite your neighbors over. Maybe I'm sure there's plenty of places in the country that are like that. But that seems to be there's a noted decline. There's less of that, right? There's a less of like. We're taught to fear our neighbor, right? It's like, oh, we're going to get sick from our neighbor because he sneezes on me. Something like ridiculous like that. Or I don't trust my neighbor because they're a certain skin color, or, you know, they just look different, or they worship differently, or they don't worship, or whatever. And so we're taught to treat our neighbor with a certain sense of apprehension and suspect, as opposed to back then, a neighbor or somebody who a stranger would be an opportunity to welcome into their community and bring them towards the greater community where you can be a part of something instead of being an outcast. EMJ continues, Cushman summarizes much of what has already been discussed in these pages and in Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control, without going into the actual historical details. Thus, quote, advertising and psychotherapy, end quote, are, quote, the professions most responsible for filling and healing the empty self, end quote, which has been created largely by the destruction of community and family. So we're going to keep going on. E. Michael Jones writes in a subtitle called Raised to be Empty, the narcissist, of course, perceives none of this, precisely because he has been raised to be, quote, empty, end quote. Narcissism is a defensive reaction based on a failure to internalize the reality principle. That choice becomes exacerbated by a culture which promotes narcissism as its ideal of behavior. Because he has been taught to choose illusion over reality, the narcissist sees any social structure which might threaten his illusions, from the family to the local community, as inherently inauthentic. So that's interesting, right? So the narcissist who's living in this fantasy world, when they come into contact with reality and there's a collision, so the narcissist feels rage and they want to attack whatever stopped that narcissistic fantasy from continuing to go on. And so often that sort of rage is directed at things like culture that have to do with family and community. All right, so we're going to get into that, right? There's this sort of link between this narcissism, tyranny, and rage, right? So EMJ writes, the only problem is that narcissism knows no limits. The fantasy tends by its very nature to grandiose expansion. The more it expands, the more it comes in contact with the reality. And the more reality thwarts its increasingly unrealistic desires, the more narcissism turns into violence. The culture of narcissism promotes the idea that all desires can be filled. When desires are not fulfilled, first anger, then rage is the result. Road rage is a good example. Commuting by car is to transportation what Quidditch is to soccer. It is fundamentally irrational activity based on narcissistic fantasy, which gives the person who drives the illusion of omnipotence while simultaneously subjecting him to a form of social control. The more he drives, the more frustrated he becomes, because his wishes are not being fulfilled. The more frustration of narcissistic fantasy, the more rage. Since narcissist fantasy by its very nature tends to frustration, a culture which promotes narcissism as the norm will be a culture full of rage and acts of unpredictable random violence. So do you see, we're starting to see here these connections with narcissism and its ugly cousins that are tied to it. We got this picture being painted. Frustration, right? Big part of that narcissism that carries with it. Frustration. You've got anger. You've got rage. You've got violence. This is what's orbiting around narcissism. I mean, listen to this. Listen to how insane anger can get, right? I don't have to tell you this, but I'm going to anyway. So this is from Seneca, right? And in this book that he wrote called On Anger. And Seneca writes, when men's minds are stuck with the opinion of injury, they fall on immediately wheresoever their passion leads them. This is what we're talking about, passion, right? Without either order, fear, or caution, provoking their own mischief, never at rest till they come to blows, and pursuing their revenge, even with their bodies, upon the points of their enemies' weapons. So that anger itself is much more hurtful for us than the injury that provokes it. For the one is bounded, but where the other will stop, no man living knows. There are no greater slaves, certainly, than those that serve anger. For they improve their misfortunes by an impatience more insupportable than the calamity that causes it. Two more things by Seneca. Listen to this. Seneca writes, reason judges according to right. Anger will have everything seem right, whatever it does. And when it has once pitched upon a mistake, it is never to be convinced, but prefers a pertinacity, even in the greatest evil, before the most necessary repentance. But even better, I think the modern, instead of even going through all that mess of like proving whether one is right or wrong, I think for the modern, they just don't care, right? They just see it and they just don't have the time for it. And so honestly, what I think happens with a lot of moderns is they just ignore it, right? They just don't care. They just ignore it because at the end of the day, who's got time for anything else when it's all about you? I mean, listen to this. Here's another thing from Seneca. Whereas anger is heedless and heady, and the virtue only of barbarous nations, which, though their bodies were much stronger and more hardened, were still worsted by the moderation and discipline of the Romans. So this is what I'm talking about here. Modernity loves to preach to everyone indulgence, right? Always indulge. Food, drug, vice, lifestyle. Do as much of it as it can, right? But there's something to be said about moderation. I get it. We all have our things that we really like, we really love to do or engage with, right? But there's something about that level of moderation, right? That is what's key. And that's what's missing so much in today's society. Moderation. teaching the value of moderation. All right, everybody, I'm going to end it with this last part from EMJ. So he writes, small communities like the family and the neighborhood, and not narcissistic fantasies of omnipotence, provide, according to Lash, quote, the best defenses against the terror of existence, end quote, because they nourish, quote, the homely comforts of love, work, and family life, which connect us to a world that is independent of our wishes, yet responsive to our needs, end quote. The best defense against, quote, escapist solutions to the psychological problems of dependence, separation, and individuation, end quote, is, quote, the moral realism that makes it possible for human beings to come to terms with existential constraints of their freedom and power, end quote. And I couldn't agree more. So there you have it. The whole article is available on this issue of Culture Wars magazine, Education as Magic. It's from January 2002. You can get it at culturewars.com. And the other book I recommend, which I referenced in this video, is Seneca's On Anger. It's a great little book, quick little read. Fascinating stuff. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video on road rage. Let me know what you think. You know, are you a big road rager? Do you do something about it? How do you handle road rage? Does it completely just unfaze you, or do you actually get out there and start whooping some ass if someone slights you? Let me know what you think, and I hope you found it helpful. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.